Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Orit Kalman. I'm a facilitator with Sac State Consensus and Collaboration Programs, and looking forward to our third meeting today on SB 552, County Drought Planning. Before we get started, I'm just going to remind everyone of logistics. We have live closed captioning available. You can turn it off if you find it distracting or you might find it helpful. Please make sure that as we start the meeting and have some presentation that you're muted. Feel free to turn the video on when we get started. When you're speaking, we'd love to see you and connect with everyone as we are in this remote meeting. Feel free to use the chat panel to add comments, respond to questions, pose questions, and we will respond and read those out loud to the extent that time allows. We'll also summarize all the input today into a meeting summary to inform the guidebook, and really want to encourage you to use the hand raise function, get into a queue, and share your thoughts in person, and really want to encourage a discussion and conversation today. So this is our third in 4 meetings, and the purpose here is to inform and solicit input from interested parties on the development of a guidebook to support the preparation of the county drought plans, which focus on state small water systems and domestic wells as required under SB 552. And you can see here, we started with our first informational session where we kind of laid the foundation and talked about SB 552. We had a meeting back in August where we focused on chapter 2 and 3, and today we're really focusing on chapter 4 and 5, short-term and long-term actions. And we will have another meeting, a final meeting, where we will present the draft guidebook ahead of public comment period. So that's coming up. So here is our agenda for today. We're just going to do a very quick recap of SB 552, just to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of requirements, and update you on the guidebook development process, where we're at. We've incorporated much of the comments and input we have received to date. And then we have a short presentation from Tulare County on their community response. And that will set us up to review chapter 4 on short-term response actions. We'll take a short break around right before 2 o'clock. And then we'll also review chapter 5, long-term mitigation strategies. And for both chapters, we really look forward to hearing from you, your input based on your local experience. That's all going to be incorporated into the guidebook. And then we'll wrap up with some next steps. We initially were hoping to have a second community local presentation, and we were unable to do that. So we may actually finish the meeting a little early today. So that will give you some time back in your schedule. Before we get started, just want to again thank the work group that was set up at the beginning of this process. About a dozen community members who have joined us ahead of each of these public meetings to dig in and give us input on what that we are presenting. So again, just a reminder to everyone to please mute as to make sure that we can move forward. So I just want to thank work group members for participating in these conversations and informing the work that we are presenting today. And with that, we just want to check in and see who's joining us. So we have a short introductory poll, so it gives you a chance to share with us the perspective that you bring to the conversation today, and also let us know which region of California you represent as a way of introduction. And feel free also to add in the chat if you want to share other perspectives or other interests that you have in this effort. We'd love to hear from you. And it looks like some of you responded, not all of you, so we'd love for you to just add to it, and then we'll move forward. Okay. All right, so here I'm just going to share the result with you. So you can see for those who responded, we have some county environmental health, Office of Emergency Services, technical assistant providers, consultant, tribal, state governments, and Karen said that from Sac Valley. I see others are adding. Thank you, and thanks all for joining us today. And with that, we are going to get started. And just want to introduce Julie Ekstrom, who's an environmental social scientist at the California Department of Water Resources. She supervises the urban unit in the water use efficiency branch and is the department lead for implementing the newly required drought planning efforts for small water suppliers in rural communities. Prior to joining the state 4 years ago, she directed a climate change adaptation research program at UC Davis. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Julie.
Hey, thanks, Arit. Great. So we are going to I'm going to go through, so we're all reoriented about SB 552 requirements and where it came from. And we'll just do this part briefly before we get to the main content.
Hey, Jeff.
So yeah, can you hear me okay? Oh, yep. Okay. Great. So Arit, for the next slide, Arit. So just going back to the 2012, 2016, the last drought, after that, and during that drought, the state saw a lot of outages and issues from water shortage and other issues that came about because we're impacting small water systems and domestic wells and state smalls around the state. And so out of that experience, the Assembly Bill 1668 and Senate Bill 606 was passed as part of that, there's this piece that directed DWR, the Department of Water Resources, to host a process to focus on small water systems and rural communities, as domestic wells and others that are on private supplies, as what was formed as the County Drought Advisory Group. And the specific directives were for that group were to come up with who among the small water systems and domestic wells, these rural communities, are vulnerable and at risk to drought and water shortage. And the other directive was to develop recommendations on how to cover these groups with some type of water shortage contingency plan, drought resilience plan. So the recommendations from that group became, at least informed the development of what's Senate Bill 552, which is what we're talking about today. And so the next slide here is that there's 3 different groups that have new requirements under Senate Bill 552. So there are a set of requirements for small water suppliers, and those we have a different webinar series. It's about that. We've been working on the water shortage contingency plan template for them. And so that is a different series, though related. And then there's the counties, which is the focus of this meeting. And the requirements for counties were to create a standing task force for state smalls and domestic wells or some alternative, and to develop a drought plan or a water shortage plan. And so that's what we're talking about here. And that's what the guidebook is being developed for. And then the state under SB 552 is pointed to maintain and keep updating the water shortage vulnerability tool and establish a standing interagency drought and water shortage task force. So today, again, we're going to focus on the counties, which I think you're all here for. Next slide. So again, the specific requirements for the counties, we're developing their drought and water shortage task force, and is specifically to cover state smalls and domestic wells, or a similar alternative, and to develop a drought plan for state smalls and domestic wells. And so just make sure that everybody understands that the law allows for a flexible format. So it can be a standalone plan, or it can be integrated as part of existing or new county plans. But the purpose is to facilitate drought and water shortage preparedness for these state small systems and the domestic wells within the county's jurisdiction. So that brings us to the county drought plan elements in the next slide. And the elements, the plan needs to include the potential drought and water shortage risk, so an assessment of risk, and then propose interim and long-term solutions for the state smalls and domestic wells. And so at a minimum, to have a plan and a proposal for consolidations, for domestic well drinking water mitigation programs, for the provision of emergency and interim drinking water solutions, the analysis of the steps to implement the plan, and analysis of funding sources. And so we've divided that into, so what is going to be talked about today is the short-term emergency response and interim solutions, and then the long-term mitigation plan. So we have those separated into two different chapters. And thank you all for participating in this process. And thank you to the State Water Board and Cal OES for all the input and participating in developing this guidebook too, and certainly to the county work group and to Stantec, who we will hear from next, and to Arit, hear from Sac State. So thank you all.
Great, thanks, Julie. And so next we have Maritza Flores Marquez, who's going to talk a little bit about the guidebook development process. And to just share a little bit, Maritza is a water resource engineer at Stantec. She is a licensed professional civil engineer in California, a certified envision specialist by the Institute of Sustainable Infrastructure. She has over 5 years of experience working with agencies to plan for the long-term reliability of the region's water resources, including developing plans, analyzing data, hydrology modeling, engineering, and working with small water systems. Most recently, she supported the development of the Upper American River Basin Regional Drought Contingency Plan to improve drought resiliency in the West Slope area of El Dorado County. So thanks, Maritza, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Ari. So right now, I'll begin to provide a quick update on where we are on the development process of this guidebook. So if we go on to the next slide, Ari, essentially, as Julie covered, the purpose of the guidebook is ultimately to provide the best planning practices for counties to be able to meet the SB 552 implementation needs for domestic wells and state smalls. So in doing that, we want to be able to leverage the local experience. And so at the first public meeting that we had, we solicited feedback in terms of who would be interested. We contacted the counties that showed interest. There were 21. And from those 21 different counties, we were able to develop a work group consisting of a county from each of the different hydrologic regions. And so since then, they've been great. They've been providing feedback. They've been reviewing internally these chapters as they are being pushed out. And so today we'll focus on chapters 4 and 5, which they recently reviewed and have had a chance to provide feedback in the last 2 weeks. And so as we move on to the next slide, here you can see a general workflow for the development and implementation process for the County Drought Resilience Plan. And so ultimately, as Julie described, there is a requirement to develop a county drought and water shortage task force that will facilitate drought and water shortage planning for state smalls and domestic well owners. They may take the lead in developing this county drought resilience plan, which can first be initially done by developing, actually completing a drought and water shortage risk assessment that will ultimately identify any type of vulnerabilities that would then be used to propose and develop short-term response actions to try to mitigate any emergency water supply needs. And then moving forward, use those identified vulnerabilities to then build off the short-term response actions and develop long-term mitigation actions to reduce some of the associated costs. All of those actions and proposed efforts would be integrated within a county drought resilience plan, which, as Julie described, could be a standalone document or can be a collection of existing and new plans in order to meet compliance needs. Because there's new data, conditions change. Ideally, these plans would be updated every 5 years as new information becomes available. And so if we hit enter, Ori, I believe it's animated. Today's focus is really on the short-term response actions and the long-term mitigation actions. So what can be done if there is a water shortage event or drought within a couple of months, and what can be done in the next round from lessons learned from some of the experiences we've seen, and that is built into the long-term mitigation actions. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Here is a quick overview on the overall guidebook development. Right now, there are 7 chapters. Each bubble provides a description of the title. So we have an intro, we have a whole chapter on the County Drought and Water Shortage Task Force, a chapter on the Drought and Water Shortage Risk Assessment, short-term response actions, long-term mitigation actions, public education and engagement, and the implementation considerations chapter. So as of now, the draft guidebook is developed. It is undergoing internal review by several state departments. And today we will focus our attention on chapter 4 and 5, and we will be interested in soliciting input from everyone here for public engagement, trying to see if there's any additional items that we may need to consider to include. And as of right now, if we move on to the next slide, this is our anticipated timeline. We are where the red dot is. So this is our 3rd public meeting. We have one more down the line anticipated for some time in possibly early December. And then before that meeting, we would have another meeting with the work group where we would review the overall guidebook and then focus on chapter 6 on the public engagement component and the implementation component of the guidebook. And as of now, we anticipate having a stable public draft sometime in mid-December. So this is the overall timeline. We're very close, and right now it's essentially undergoing state review, and we'll be soliciting feedback from everyone today on the current chapters 4 and 5. I believe that is all for me on my part, Ori. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Marita. And so want to move forward and to our next presentation, and really grateful to have with us today Denise England, who is Water Resource Director for the County of Tulare. In the 17 years that Ms. England has worked for Tulare County, she has brought more than $50 million in state and federal funding for disadvantaged community water solutions in the county through innovative projects, regional perspective, and leveraging relationships with non-governmental organizations, cities, and funding agencies. Ms. England continues to work closely with communities and partners to identify and achieve sustainable water solutions while continuously seeking new ways to move them forward in regional strategies through consolidation and regional governance. Ms. England received her BA in Organizational Leadership from Fresno Pacific University and MSA from California State University, Bakersfield. She resides in Tulare with her husband and 3 children. So thanks for joining us, Denise, and we're ready for your presentation.
Great, thank you so much. So I just want to preface my talk here today to recognize that a lot of the can you guys hear me okay? Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
There are a lot of legitimate concerns from counties, and Tulare County was not did not have it. It wasn't that we had no concerns when they first embarked on looking to play a role in this space of drought and water shortage planning with the last drought. And in a lot of ways, we were forced into this space through some pretty serious circumstances during the previous drought. So in the beginning, I think when Julie opened, there was a picture from East Porterville of a family accessing water at their home for the first time in 2016. And I believe that home had been out of water for at least 5, if not 6 years or more. And so Tulare County has been working in this space since that time, and we've actually seen some pretty good results that then lessen our future role because we're solving problems along the way. So that's the perspective that I kind of wanted to share today. So you can go ahead and advance to the next slide, please. So there's several roles that a county can play. Certainly you have the planning perspective. Okay, land use planning, code enforcement, building inspections. This touches a little bit on red tagging. So when a home is out of water, the county has authority to red tag that home as a health and safety issue. I'll talk a little bit about how we've approached that issue. In a lot of cases, the county is the primacy agency. In Tulare County, we're only primacy for state smalls. In other counties, there's a larger portfolio of water systems that the county is serving as the primacy agency. We also serve as a facilitator, so we can get all of the parties kind of together and building those relationships and identifying solutions. In a lot of ways, we stand in the gap. We can apply for funding on behalf of communities, on behalf of water systems, and on behalf of communities of private domestic wells where a water system doesn't exist. And then, of course, SB 552 has carved out specific roles that counties now have to undertake, including the Drought Task Force or something similar, and then the effort that we're talking about now, the Drought and Water Shortage Contingency Plan. And so with that as a backdrop, I'm going to share kind of Tulare County's approach and thoughts of this. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So I call this the sustainability continuum. And this depicts moving folks along from being pretty unsustainable and vulnerable and at risk, such as being on a single private domestic well, all the way to a full consolidation with a large municipal water system. So we have several examples where we have communities that were on private domestic wells and maybe 15, 20, 50 homes in one geographic area all experienced dry wells. And we were able to, maybe there was funding available to construct part of a small water system. So maybe out of 50 homes, we were able to connect 30 of them, or maybe we were able to connect, you know, if there was just there was an example where there's a street of like 25 homes and we were able to connect all 25 homes. And then from that point, looking for the next tranche of funding to then develop a full small community water system, and then moving that into undergirding a larger municipal water system. Maybe they need an additional source of supply. Maybe they need a tank. Maybe they need more storage. Maybe they need some sort of treatment. Maybe they need the intertie. And so working with them to secure that, whatever they might need, to then fully consolidate and take on what used to be a community of small private domestic wells. And I'll share in between each of these steps, there's probably even more smaller steps. And it's really, we have found that the county can really be kind of that long-term, long-range vision of where this these folks need to go in order to be sustainable and to get out of that vulnerability of relying on a private domestic well. And I'll also share that this is typically a bottom-up approach. We're not going into communities and saying, okay, all of you need to now become part of a water system. Although the state board certainly has that authority to do that now. But typically these are people coming to us or coming to our nonprofit partners saying, help, we're out of water, what do we do? And so instead of going out and drilling a bunch of new private wells, we look at the situation and say, well, it would be more sustainable to be on a water system, and then it would be more sustainable to be a bigger water system, and then it would be more sustainable to be part of a regional water system. And so that's where this continuum comes in, and that's where having some guidance and vision and facilitation by the county is really helpful, so you're not recreating the same problem later on. And we're seeing a little bit of that now, where in the last drought, folks drilled a deeper well or drilled a new well. And now, 5 years later, they're experiencing some of the same drought impacts. And some of that is just they're so remote, there's not a place to tie them in. Some of it is because they chose not to be part of a water system. And so really addressing this when you can then decreases what you have to address maybe later on. So the next slide, please. So these are some things that Tulare County has used to approach the problem. Tulare County, for those of you that don't know where we are, we're in the central San Joaquin Valley between Fresno and Bakersfield. The county is actually the size of the state of Connecticut. We only have 500,000 people living in our county. The majority of them live in our 7 incorporated cities, and then we have literally hundreds of small, mostly disadvantaged, mostly underserved communities throughout the county. Half of our landmass is in federal forests, so our population is pretty much in half of the landmass, but it's still pretty rural and pretty remote. And in 2011, Tulare County created a position to coordinate the efforts of all things water. And that I had worked for the county previously, but I was promoted to take on kind of the role that I serve now, which is to engage in with irrigation districts, with small water districts, with the surface water contractors, to really start to bring together and identify areas where we can agree, areas where we can collaborate. And then, of course, Sigma came along, and I coordinated those efforts throughout the county. And then with the drought, working with all of those partners and those relationships that I had developed to meet the various household needs. We took advantage of several grant opportunities. We developed a web tool, which I will show you in a moment. I was able to create a network of NGO partners, water system partners, community partners, and then other water agency partners to really kind of build up what was our task force, and then beyond that into longer term, longer range projects and planning endeavors. And then, as I mentioned before, we also bridge the gap where communities lack capacity. So if they were, if a community is ineligible, so for example, if they're just a bunch of private domestic wells, they don't have an overarching governance structure to apply on behalf of themselves. And there's a little more options now through nonprofit partners. But back when we first started, really the county was the only applicant that could stand in that gap for private well communities. And so we've taken on that for in several areas. And then, like I mentioned, we are involved with all of the groundwater sustainability agencies in our county. We have about a dozen of those. We are members of several, which means that we hold a position on their governing board. We participate in their technical advisory committee. I host a bi-monthly GSA manager county staff meeting. And within that framework, we talk about how our domestic wells are permitted. We address the governor's executive order. We work on things relative to our general plan and make sure that the groundwater sustainability plans are in alignment with the general plan, or identify places that the general plan may need to be revised in the future. It's a space to share ideas and information. The groundwater sustainability agencies have the well data and the models, and so fostering those relationships, we can partner with them to use their data and their models, and then they will be the place for the well mitigation efforts. And we're still developing that, although there has been some movement within sort of an emergency type program relative to our current conditions. So you can move on to the next slide. I mentioned that we developed a web tool. So this is the landing page, and it is a GIS-based tool that allows, you can query for a variety of things. You can query for disadvantaged communities, you can query for certain contamination, and then it also gives you a spatial view of proximity to other communities. So it can kind of, when you're working a problem, it allows you to spatially view what they're close to, and then you can easily identify if where you're looking to potentially consolidate or regionalize, what the other challenges are in the area. And this particular tool was funded through a grant from the Department of Water Resources, through the IRWIN program, and it covers a 4-county region that makes up the Tulare Lake Basin funding area. So it covers Tulare County, Kings County, the western portion of Kern County, and the majority of Fresno County. And we can go on to the next slide. And then this tab is represents private well densities. So it is color coded. Green is a lower density, and then the darker it goes all the way to red means the highest density. So you can see these sections. There's sections of green, which means there's few private domestic wells, and then there's sections of orange, yellow, and then the darker orange, which indicates higher concentrations of domestic wells, which this is a tool we used early on this spring to sort of identify areas where our nonprofit partners could go out and do some direct outreach to begin to identify private well owners that may be vulnerable to the drought impacts that we saw coming. So you can move on to the next slide. This zooms in a little closer, so you can see there's a yellow line that runs through, and I apologize that it's pretty small and so it's hard to read, but the yellow line is a groundwater contour. And then when you click on the section, it will tell you the number of wells, it will tell you the minimum depth of the wells in that section, it'll tell you the maximum depth, and then the average depth and the median depth. And so this was super helpful in identifying. So one of our main partners is Self-Help Enterprises. And so, you know, in February and March and April, when we were realizing we're going to have another dry year, what do we, you know, we know what's coming, but we don't really know where it's going to come. So, because it's not like a flood where you can see it on the surface, right? It's underground. And so, so we use this tool to say, okay, well, we know we have a lot of wells in this particular area. We know that the groundwater occurs at this level, and we know that their average depth is pretty close to that. So go out, and they went knocking door to door and make contact and see if we can assess their wells. They have a funding source that allows them to sound the well and get a depth, and then they can also do some testing for for constituent contamination. And so that's what they did. And that's how we early on identified who's going to be most at risk. And then they were on the radar to provide the relief that we had. So you can go to the next slide. So a couple of case studies I wanted to touch on before I wrap up here. East Porterville was probably the community that forced us into this space. We had 1,200 homes eventually that were out of water. And the media, we had national and international news media attention. And at that time, back in 2013, 2014, we didn't have a lot of resources. A lot of the resources that are available today to counties and nonprofits were actually born here in Tulare County and threaded through Cal OES and the State Water Board and a little bit with DWR of like, this is the tanks and hauled water is the only immediate solution that we can come up with. And yes, it's cheaper probably to construct a new water system, but the permitting and the contracting and all of that is going to take too long. And so we need immediate response. And so East Porterville was really the community that caused those programs to be developed because of the just the high rate of impact there. And so they were consolidated with the city of Porterville. The city of Porterville actually encompassed the community of East Porterville on 3 sides. The city was not super excited to be of help, but between the media pressure and the pressure from the state and then the funding that financed the project, they came alongside and developed a process by which residents of East Porterville, which are still county residents, but they're receiving water service from the city of Porterville. And the city was able to put in some caveats, like they required when folks came to sign up for water service from the city to become a customer of the city, they also required a document recorded on the deed that said at such time that the city chose to annex East Porterville, that parcel would be an automatic yes vote. And so they were able to do that and kind of and then the community of Munson, it was a community of small domestic wells. It's near the community of Sultana, but it was too far away to do a quick intertie. And actually to this date, they're not physically connected to Sultana yet, although that project is moving forward. So this community, it's about 50 wells, 50 homes, and 27 of them were in an area that they were pretty dense, and we were able to identify a well site and tank site for them. And so we drilled a new well, we installed a storage tank, and then we were able to run the start of a distribution system to the first 27 homes in this community, with the idea that eventually the rest of the community would be built out and then they would have an intertie with the community of Sultana. Unfortunately, State Board had a little bit of amnesia somewhere along the way and withdrew their commitment to Sultana for an additional supply. But that's been ironed out. They're now getting their additional supply. And like I said, that full project is is underway now and should be finished within a few years. And so these are 2 really good examples of moving folks from the private domestic well to a larger municipal water system and along that sustainability continuum. Next slide, please. And that is all I have. And there's my contact information if you would like to reach out directly with any questions, or I'm happy to answer questions as well.
This is great. Thanks, Denise. Really appreciate you starting with the importance of collaboration and networks and bringing people together to do this work and laying out the continuum for resilience. It looks like there is a hand raised for questions. I'm going to let that person ask or make a comment, and we may be able to take another comment before we move forward. So go ahead, the person on the phone, you should be able to unmute. There you go.
Thank you. This is Becky Steinbrunner calling in from Santa Cruz County. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I'm only able to hear coming in by telephone, not able to see any of the slides because my internet is pretty much out today. But you did mention that you have a group that gets together for various things. And you mentioned the governor's executive order. I think that's N-7-22. Paragraph 9, Part B is a big concern here, and I'm wondering what Tulare County is doing regarding that that issue of restrictions, new restrictions, and expert qualifications necessary in order to permit new wells.
So we worked out, so the group that I mentioned is all of the groundwater sustainability agency managers that manage a groundwater sustainability agency within Tulare County meets every other month. We'll meet tomorrow afternoon with county staff. So sometimes it just depends on our agenda, but sometimes that's planning staff, sometimes that's environmental health staff. We've had various topics. And so when the governor's executive order came in, we met with our GSA managers and went to work on that Part B portion. And we developed an affidavit that the GSAs sign off on and say, yes, the proposed well falls within the parameters of our groundwater sustainability plan. And then the GSAs have a landowner agreement that goes out to the landowner that says, yes, I will operate this well within the confines of the groundwater sustainability plan. And so that is how we're covering Part B. In some cases, we were hoping for a uniformed form, but all of the GSAs had a little bit different versions of the form. They're pretty similar, but there's some nuances in them depending on the GSA. And so each GSA developed their own set of forms. And then where the GSA chose not to develop a form, we've directed landowners to get a certified hydrogeologist to make those findings. However, the GSAs that we don't have forms for don't have any well applications either. So we haven't actually encountered having to get a professional to make any findings yet. We're relying upon the work that was done as part of the groundwater sustainability plans.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Becky, for your question. There are a couple of additional questions in the chat, and also David has a hand raised. So let's take David's question, and then we'll come back to a couple of things in the chat.
Yeah, this is David Davis from San Diego County Office of Emergency Services. And forgive me if you already answered this in other meetings, but what are you going to do, or are we going to do for the domestic well owner that's way separated from anybody? There's no way of consolidation. And the only feasible solution has been water deliveries. And now it's kind of being tasked to us to look at how we're going to meet this need. And not being a water purveyor, it's kind of surprising. What are we going to do? A lot of these wells are from the 1800s, 1900s, and are all going dry in a lot of areas in our county. We're just wondering, what are some of the solutions for that?
Sure, and we definitely have similar solutions. Most of what I was talking about was, moving folks from a private well situation to a municipal system. And obviously that's not always feasible. And we're actually seeing a lot of that this time around. Whereas last time we had a lot of dense well outages, we're now seeing those ones and twos that are very remote and very rural. And so in those cases, really the only option is hauled water and the drilling of a new well. Something that I'm actually going to be talking with our groundwater sustainability agencies tomorrow about is going forward, how do we incorporate the groundwater sustainability agency's minimum thresholds into our well permitting process? So historically, a well driller would go out, drill a well, hit water, drill a little deeper, call it good, because every foot costs money and every foot costs money to pump that water out as well. But we need to probably be a little more thoughtful in that process and making sure that where our GSAs have put that minimum threshold, that we're providing feedback to the driller and to the property owner that that well needs to be drilled, you know, at some depth below that minimum threshold to make sure that that well stays in water during future dry times. And that's where our GSAs really come into play in their data and their expertise. There are some very Pollyanna-ish folks that I've met along the way that, you know, point to other states like South Dakota that have rural water systems that run, you know, hundreds of miles throughout a very rural area and provide water that way. And I mean, certainly we could look at that, but you know, at this time, to me, that seems very, very expensive and pretty infeasible. And to your point, who owns and operates that? Counties typically aren't water purveyors, and we are, and I will say we're probably not good at it. We're very expensive when we run a water system, and so you know, how do you tackle that is a big question mark. But if you are permitting new domestic wells, working with the groundwater sustainability agencies to make some assurances that those will remain in water based on their findings is probably the best next step for the current situation.
All right, thanks, David, for your question. And Denise, you really speak to the importance of the long-term thinking and being very strategic in planning. There are a couple of questions that speak to the funding. And so first, Vince is asking with regard to homes that are dependent on wells when they are brought into the existing water system, what is the cost responsibilities for the homeowners? And so if you can speak to that, what happens to the wells in that situation? And then more globally, Mario is asking about funding for consolidation, understanding that planning and permitting is quite expensive. So if you can speak to those funding and cost issues.
So depending on the project, because as I mentioned before, most of our communities are disadvantaged or severely disadvantaged and categorized as underserved. So a lot of the projects were funded 100%. Early on, some of the costs were not eligible. So for example, the service line from the meter box to the house was ineligible. And so we set up kind of a self-help model where we had an organization called Self-Help work with the homeowner to dig their own trench and lay their own pipe to connect their service line, which that's a little bit of sweat equity and some supplies. They could also hire somebody to do that. Now, most of that is included in the project costs with the grant. As far as the wells go, in some cases, the property owner chose to keep the well and they agreed to pay for it and have installed a backflow prevention device. It's not only a one-time cost, that has an annual cost of about $100 to be certified that the air gap is intact and that the device is working properly. And in other cases, we included well destruction either as a separate grant program through I think we did one through the Department of Water Resources, IRWIM funding. And then I think in East Porterville, DWR also picked up the cost to abandon those wells. That does become tricky because not only do you have to get a property owner to agree to connect to a new water system, which they may or may not want to do, But then you're asking them also to give up what they have been relying upon for water for all of these years, albeit dry at this point. And especially on parcels that are large and are like mini ranchette kind of things, the idea of purchasing all of your water from a municipal supply, for a garden and for, livestock and all of that, that can get pretty pricey. So that's where we rely on our community partners and our nonprofits to do the outreach and kind of lay out, this is what you're gaining by giving this up. And that usually folks tend to, make those decisions based on that outreach and feedback. And then the other question was funding. Yeah, so again, most of our planning and permitting is grant funded, a lot of it through state board, although like East Porterville Department of Water Resources actually ran a portion of that project. Their engineers designed a portion of the project, and then they hired directly some contractors. That was a little bit unique for that previous drought round. Now the drought funding is it's a little more codified and resting in departments and not such an OES type response. We've also set aside ARPA money at the county to address some of the former drought projects as well that didn't get funded the first go around.
Well, this has been very helpful, Denise. Thank you. As we're going to turn into reviewing the chapters on both short-term and long-term, I think your presentation really set us up to be thinking about laying out the foundation and thinking about all the partners, the funding opportunities, and the outreach, the tools that you shared with us. So really appreciate that. I'm thinking, given the time right now, that we can take just a quick 5 minutes to do a quick stretch, and then when we come back, we will focus on the two chapters for our discussion today. Great to be informed by Denise's presentation and experience in Tulare County, and we're looking forward to hearing from you on the experience that you bring into this conversation. So I have 1:52, so let's reconvene at 1:57 for the next presentation on the guidebook chapters. Thanks, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone. And I think we're ready to move forward and review chapter 4. So I'll turn it over to you, Maritza.
Great, thanks, Ari. So as we covered earlier, today's focus is on chapters 4 and 5, and right now we're going to dive into the short-term response actions. So if we move on to the next slide, please. Here's an example that many counties may have, come across. This is an image from Glenn County. The county actually was able to deliver a 1,500-gallon potable water tank to residents who had recently experienced wells running dry during this recent drought over the summer. So what we'll do is we'll cover some of the legislation. So if you go on the next slide. In terms of short-term response actions, the legislation per Water Code section 10609.70, it specifies that a county shall develop a plan that includes potential drought and water shortage risk and proposed interim solutions for state small water systems and domestic wells within a county's jurisdiction. So specifically, at a minimum, that means that counties should provide a provision of emergency and interim drinking water solutions. And so that, in a sense, it's a bit broad. Emergency and interim drinking water solutions can be a series of different actions. And so if we move on to the next slide, counties essentially have the flexibility of coming up with a series of actions to ultimately be able to provide these emergency water supplies to households that are in distress, specifically within these state smells and domestic wells, in order to meet compliance with SB 552. So as these counties develop these portfolios of emergency preparedness, essentially they're going to vary by county. It's going to vary depending on the local needs, the resources available, and the preferences, and just ultimately what makes sense. And so within our guidebook, we focus on 3 actions of these specific emergency and interim drinking water solutions that could be leveraged. On here, we show that first and second line of defense. First is to leverage any existing infrastructure in coordination with any mutual aid agreements to be able to distribute this emergency water supply. So an intertie, as I have on here, is the interconnection between water systems, permitting the exchange or delivery of a water between themselves. And then a mutual aid agreement is any type of assistance, usually a network that provides personnel, equipment, materials, and associated services from utilities to restore critical operations impacted during any type of emergency. And so, as I said, first line and second line of defense can be a combination of both of these, using existing infrastructure to provide that type of emergency water supplies within local communities that are within close approximate location to any of the larger water purveyors. So what we have included in this chapter is a template on how counties may go about on developing these mutual aid agreements. They can use it as reference, build off of it. And we also provide a case study on what Butte County's done in terms of being able to provide water supplies to some of, communities have gone dry when they work with Paradise Irrigation District. And so essentially mutual aid agreements, they lay the groundwork for how communities will help each other while maintaining their independence. And after this first and second line of defense comes in, the third item is then to explore other options that are most commonly used, which is relying on establishing those fill stations. And so on here on the slide, we actually have we have an example from El Dorado County, and the El Dorado Irrigation District has fill stations that were used during the last drought, where community members were able to come in and take the water that they needed through their own, after coordinating with EID in terms of how they can actually get access to this water. Usually this route, takes a lot more effort to plan in advance, to coordinate, probably a lot more costly too, since you have to plan for, getting those hauling water trucks, the cost to store and distribute the water supplies, getting those water tanks out to the folks that need it, gas with the hauling of these water trucks. And so for this third line of defense, we do list all these different actions, but we also base a lot of the planning efforts tied with this based on the 2014 emergency drinking water procurement and distribution planning guidance that has been developed by Cal OES. We are using the 2014 version, and we do understand that it's currently being updated. So depending on when that's available, we'll definitely be sure to make sure that what is in the guidebook is in alignment with any of the latest version of that document. And so ultimately within this chapter, we provide information currently with the distribution, logistics on how to best do this, information regarding the distribution, logistics, communication, best practices involved with trying to get any of this implemented and off the ground. And so if we move on to the next slide, this chapter, as I mentioned earlier, has been reviewed by the work group, and their feedback has been very, very significant and helpful. Through these discussions that we've had with them, they've been able to provide their experience in terms of how they've actually formed mutual aid agreements. One shared their experience in terms of mutual aid agreements were set long before any type of water shortage experience occurred, getting all the local water purveyors in the same room, very clearly stating what are some of the limitations, some of the challenges that they may have, what is the level of effort they may be able to provide once there is an emergency, and just clearly laying out the expectations on what can be done. Some counties have been able to provide templates on what they've actually used for developing these mutual aid agreements. So as I said, we have a copy of one of those in the guidebook in one of the appendices. And then also just learning from all the counties in terms of what are some of the challenges that they've experienced. It's, like I said, their portfolio of some of the actions that they may be able to implement will vary depending on resources and just where everything is, funding. And so for us, it's just important to hear that. So then we can be more mindful of what is being recommended, because maybe the solution for one may not be the solution for all. So we've definitely been involved and engaged with the work group. And so if we move on to the next slide. As I said, our guidebook right now for the short-term mitigation actions has a focus on these 3 different lines of defense, one being a combination of the interties with the mutual aid agreement and being able to leverage these existing infrastructures to be able to provide emergency water supplies, and also just depending on those mutual aids, by being able to get resources through personnel, being able to provide emergency water supplies at a set time, frequency, once there's a trigger identified by the county with the water purveyor, and then ultimately providing that additional water supplies through bottled water, hauling of water, fill stations, etc. So based on these actions that are really geared towards resolving a issue that is within the next couple of months, it's really a Band-Aid solution. Are there any additional actions that would be helpful to include within the guidebook as guidance or as options that counties could look into further and that we could potentially provide additional guidance on? So this is a question for those on here today. Happy to hear what folks have to say, or if there's any comments or questions regarding Chapter 4.
Thanks, Maritza. Kyle, go ahead.
Hi, Maritza. The one thing that I think is kind of a little bit of a misnomer is they talk about interim or storage tanks, like in people's houses, where they could have hot water delivered. They also need to have a pump station there. So I think that whenever it gets discussed, everybody just talks about the tanks, but they should be well aware that they need to have a pump and like a bladder pressure tank in addition to that. So because I just think it gives because it really is too much of a simplistic answer. So I think anytime you mention tanks, it should include, a pump system to be able to reestablish service at that residence or wherever. So
Thanks, Kyle.
my 2 cents.
Yeah, so remembering that with the water delivery, there is infrastructure and other resources that need to support it to make that a viable option.
Yep.
Very good. Great. Thank you. Anybody else want to add on the phone, the 831? Go ahead. You should be able to unmute. There you go.
Oh, thank you. Hello, this is Becky Steinbrunner from Santa Fe. I also feel that this planning needs to incorporate water for rural firefighting. And I don't know how you address that, whether it's tanks dedicated for fire protection or how that's addressed, but I think that's a big piece for the rural communities to consider.
Julie, feel free to add, but I believe that the guidebook is specifically for state smells and domestic wells. So I don't believe that most of their water supplies would be used for combating wildfires. So unclear on whether that would be something that we would add. As of now, I don't believe that would fit within this guidebook. Wondering if you have anything else to add, Julie.
Yeah, I'm wondering if that's already being worked on through other county planning. I have seen at least one county I was familiar with had a requirement that for any remodeling that was done to a home, they had to put a fire tank or a water tank on their property that was like within a certain distance of the home now. But that wouldn't be part of SB 552. There are requirements for small water systems and for fire flow requirements under SB 552, but that wouldn't be for this county portion of the plan, relating to domestic wells and state smalls.
All right, thank you. Yangshin, it looks like you're off mute. Did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think the fire flow and all that kind of things that may be something we may want to look into. I know some of the small water system, when they're planning that, they do include in that part because they're remote. The fire rescue may not come so fast and so on and so forth. That's maybe a necessary consideration. I think, Kyle, you're working with one of the small water systems. It's bigger than the state small, and that has that component in there as well, as I recall, in Eldorado side.
Yes. Yeah. So that's for those type of systems. If they're requiring an upgrade, that is for like after a fire occurs, when you rebuild, you have to have sufficient water there to run the internal sprinklers in the house. And so that's not going to provide really external fire protection. It's more internal to the dwelling. But we do have that issue, specifically in Grizzly Flats after the Caldor fire, that their pre-existing water service lines don't have the capacity to actually provide that to the house directly. So an alternate is people having to have their own tank and a pumping system to be able to address the new fire flow requirements internal to a residence. So it's not going to give you any major wildfire protection or anything like that. It's strictly internal to the structure.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Becky, for bringing it up. It looks like Josh was just to add to that particular conversation, saying that to Josh's knowledge, rural schools provide hydrants for rural firefighting, regardless if it's on the school campus or community at large. Martha is adding, regarding firefighting, I'm aware of permanent water tanks being built for multiple purposes. The tanks are a backup for non-potable uses, which relieves pressure on the well that provides drinking water. An integrated system in rural areas will help. So thanks for the comments and just adding to this particular topic that Becky brought up. David, go ahead.
Being an old fire guy, we do lots and lots of rural firefighting out in San Bernardino County, and wherever I fought fire, is just that the water tenders are automatically essentially sent with every response, and it kept part of it. The other, I got feedback.
Yeah.
Owen, you go, Mike. But for the law, it's definitely, it's not including firefighting and water capability. You're going to make this is more or less for, I guess, drinking water, as far as I know. And I don't know if we're really going to be adding to a law, and a lot of this is going to be part of a plan separate when you have your HMPs or your rural firefighting plans that you'd have on a county level.
All right, thanks for adding. It looks like there are a couple more comments with regard to that. So go ahead, Kyle, and then Kyle will come back to you.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to echo what Martha Davis said about permanent water tanks being built for multiple purposes. In addition to the water being used for putting out fires, unexpected fires. The water could also be used for swamp coolers, especially in the summer, as many rural communities rely on swamp coolers to stay cool in the summer, especially during extreme heat, which is predicted to be more prevalent in California in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Go ahead, Kyle.
And here's just another issue when you're talking about water storage and small water systems that I've run across in my career, is that if you have real small water systems, and you try to put a big tank out there, and based upon your potable water supply, the water goes bad, and so then you have bad water and you can't serve your customers. So there's kind of there's just a tough spot there that you can't actually store enough water really to have substantial effects to any type of, especially rural fires. So that's just something to think about. I know people just talk about having water storage, but if you get a bunch of, if it sits there too long, you get too much trihalomethanes, you're gonna have continuous bad water. And I've actually seen a community overbuild their storage, and they were never able to use it. So just something to keep in mind.
Thanks, Kyle. And just to bring back to your previous comment with regard to the additional resources needed for water tanks, Denise says we use booster pumps, which sometimes require an upgrade to the electrical panel too. Definitely bigger than just setting a pump. So just remembering that when you introduce a short-term solution, you have to consider the infrastructure that will support that. Any other comments or suggestions for what needs to be added to this chapter as we're thinking about these short-term actions? And would be great to hear if what Maritza covered resonate with you. So validating that would be helpful, as well as additional information that can be added to the chapter. Anything else we're missing? Well, I don't see any hand raises or comments, so feel free to, as you think through it, to add things and we can come back to it. And in the interest of time, Maritza, I'm thinking maybe we move to the next chapter, and then we can kind of come back to combine thinking of both the long-term and the short-term and how they connect.
Great. So we'll move on to chapter 5, which has a focus on the long-term mitigation strategy and action. So it's now looking in the future, given these short-term solutions that are really Band-Aid, what can we do moving forward that's a little bit more permanent and can help us save a little bit more money? So if we go on to the next slide, this is really based again on the legislation. So again, we refer to Water Code section 10609.70, and on here specifically in bold, it says a county shall develop a plan that includes potential drought and water shortage risk and proposed long-term solutions for state small water systems and domestic wells within the county's jurisdiction. Within the legislation, it specifically says that there needs to be a discussion on consolidation for existing water systems and domestic wells, in addition to a domestic well drinking water mitigation program. So within our existing chapter, we touch on those two in addition to 2 other items. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Here, it's just a really quick update on short-term versus long-term. And so the short-term response actions, as I said, are really geared towards resolving the immediate drought and water shortage needs, whereas the long-term mitigation actions are really geared towards providing, again, a more permanent solution to areas susceptible to drought and water shortage, expected to reduce, and ultimately by implementing these long-term mitigation actions and strategies, it's anticipated that you would reduce the need and cost for emergency response moving forward. And so within the chapter, the bulleted items are the components covered. Again, the first 2 are directly off the legislation. So there being a discussion on a drinking water well mitigation program, system consolidation, similar to what Denise and Glenn talked a little bit about earlier with what happened in Tulare County. Also looking into regional water infrastructure for augmenting water supplies, bringing more water in within the county to be able to develop enterprise items like that. And then looking into potentially data gap filling that ultimately informs this whole planning process. So I'll go through each of these different items. And the first thing we'll touch on is the drinking water well mitigation program. So right now there's a subsection on this. And essentially what this is that it is an approach to reducing the risk of any wells having any type of outages and it tied to like water quality, just water being present either because there's some type of water shortage event or just drought. And so on here, we touch on 3 different items, one of it referring back to the drought and water shortage risk assessment, and doing that, as described earlier in this whole workflow process, counties can identify some of their vulnerabilities in areas that are more susceptible to having some of these water shortages, depending on, some of the local factors. And so based on that, the approach for this drinking water well mitigation program is to develop proposed solutions for preventing future wells from running dry, and then proposing solutions for preventing existing wells from running dry. Again, both of those items tying back to the lessons learned from the completion of the drought and water shortage risk assessment. So some of those actions that could fall within this drinking water well mitigation program could be as simple as, and I think, moving forward, because there are existing groundwater efforts, for example, is directly communicating and coordinating with some of the local groundwater sustainability agencies that are in the area. So if there are any, working with them directly, expanding upon some of the actions that they have right now. So that could be expanding the groundwater well monitoring network just to have a better understanding of the overall county, what areas may be in trouble, and just help gather information and data and be better prepared moving forward. It's building off existing management actions. It's being able to track water table depths, being able to track groundwater levels, water quality, etc. Being able to develop wells that may consider some of those minimum thresholds that are set by the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. So it's really laying out the foundation on how future wells can prevent from going dry in the future, and how can you prevent existing wells from going dry. So that's what that component is on. The next subsection that we cover is on system consolidation. And essentially that is where you have the joining of 2 or more water systems. So it's usually, mostly will happen in our case, is where you will have a larger water system that will absorb a smaller one. So they have a lot more water reliability moving forward. And so this specific subsection is based on the existing guidance that is provided by the Water Board. And so we directly reference that. We also understand that if physical system consolidation is not an option, there could be the other option of managerial consolidation, which is ultimately where another larger water system, if they consolidate, could provide staff resourcing in order to help them continue to meet their day-to-day needs and operations. So we cover both of those items. Again, both consolidation and that drinking water well mitigation program are items that need to be discussed in the development of this county drought resilience plan to meet compliance with the SB 552 legislation. The next item, if we go on to the next slide, please, is then looking at what we've called the regional water infrastructure investment. So essentially it's looking at the overall county. There's probably been different planning efforts that have occurred, either through integrated regional water management plans, drought contingency plans, drought plans, urban water management plans, where there's possibly a series of projects that have been identified that would ultimately help augment local water supply. So if there is a plan to create an intertie with another water system, the addition of that intertie could augment the water supply for the local water purveyor that could in turn help with the consolidation of maybe small state malls that are within the vicinity. And so it's looking at the bigger picture planning, continuing to work with GSAs, going through existing planning efforts to identify if there are any type of infrastructure projects that could augment water supplies. Are there any projects that could help secure water supplies? And just looking for some type of game plan and just having these projects identified, and now maybe having some reasonable argument to help push them forward, because it will increase water supplies locally to help state smalls and domestic wells moving forward. And lastly, if we go on to the last slide, we touch on data gap filling. And ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, data and conditions will change. And so ideally, this drought and water shortage risk assessment is not something that will be done once and never done again. Data changes, resources change. And so ideally, if there are any data gaps or any data that is questionable, that data will continue to be refined or collected or identified to be collected if it doesn't already exist. And so it's identifying a game plan of how that data will be collected to help develop a plan moving forward for long-term water supply planning. And so here on the slide, it's really just identifying what data is missing, who's going to collect it, who's going to be responsible, where is money potentially going to come from to be able to collect this data to inform best practices, needs, et cetera, identifying the parameters. So is it going to be collected monthly, 6 months, once a year, et cetera, where. So it's really being able to collect this data to continue to inform processes moving forward. And so if we go on to the last slide of this section, this chapter has also been reviewed by the work group. It was reviewed in the last 2 weeks. They provided feedback. And again, a lot of the feedback we got is because this is long-term planning, and if there are groundwater sustainability agencies within the county, it's going to definitely be a collaborative effort. So definitely working with local agencies that can do something like the groundwater sustainability agencies to be able to collaborate and meet the SB 552 implementation. Also in this process, we were able to learn about what some counties are actually planning to do. One of the items that was discussed that is going to be included in our chapter 7 of the guidebook is essentially providing recommendations of, maybe increasing staffing within the county to help implement some of these proposed actions moving forward. Just having people that are specifically responsible for, helping with the plan development, overseeing it, mobilizing the emergency water supplies when it's time to, making sure that the ball is rolling for long-term actions that are proposed, the collection of data, et cetera. So I think that data or information and discussion has been really helpful within the work group that we have seen to try to integrate. And if we go on to the next slide, this is just a recap on some of the items that we touch on. We understand that a portfolio of long-term mitigation actions and strategies can vary, and there could be different ways and approaches. And again, it's going to vary by county, by resources, by staffing. But we want to throw this question of, is there anything in addition to what has been covered that may be helpful to account for and include in this guidebook so that we can provide some type of guidance? If there's any additional resources or experiences that would be worthwhile to share to help put counties in a better position moving forward, I think that'd be very helpful for us to hear. Again, 2 of these are focused because it's directly from the legislation. Others are really other planning efforts or just actions that could help. So we can definitely open the floor and start with any questions or comments.
Great, thanks, Maritza. So right before we start this conversation, just wrapping up the conversation we had before around short-term, Kyle's comment around water quality, especially for those on the phone, just want to let you know that there was a follow-up chat from Karen Embry asking if safety issues with regard to water tasting and standard be included in chapter 4 measures. And the response from Julie that will be considered in the chapters. I just wanted to make sure that everybody was able to kind of see the wrap up for that comment. And then before we take Gary's comment in person, Paul Lego is asking as with regard to the SB 552 requirements, what set of factors requires the consolidation of a smaller mutual water company into a larger company? And the question comes from Paul's concern about the case where a small mutual is being forced to consolidate against its will. Consolidation creates huge potential financial and political issues for a troubled small mutual water company. So can we just provide a little bit of the background around the SB 552 requirements as it relates to consolidation?
From my understanding, I can take this, Julie, and then feel free to add on.
No,
From my understanding, the way I see it, it's one of the many options. It's not like you have to hold yourself accountable to consolidate if that happens to be the most reasonable, best solution for a cluster of state smalls within the proximity of a large water system. Sure, that's fine. But if it makes more sense to maybe build an intertie or these series of domestic wells to just become a new public water system, sure. I think it's going to vary depending on each county's resources and what makes sense, but it doesn't say that you have to consolidate. I think it's just more, this is something that needs to be taken into consideration as a potential option. Julie, is there anything else? Feel free to add.
No, that's right. So SB 552 doesn't do forced consolidations, but it is supposed to be something that counties consider in this plan. So, that consider means you should probably write a justification or, explanation of what direction the county is intending to go with consolidation or not. And, where it's appropriate or where it might not be appropriate. And these issues that you raised, would be entirely relevant. There might be some, I know that there are people from the water board that are on the phone. If they want to answer to, they're welcome to. Because there are consolidation processes ongoing.
So I think to that question, I think the important thing is to clarify that this is not a requirement. It's a long-term option for consideration as appropriate and relevant to the specific county, is what you're both responding with. Amy is asking, continuing on the topic of consolidation, for consolidation, is the information only for a state, small individual wells with a larger state system? We have many areas in our county with state smalls next to each other. Is there any information on how a county would handle consolidating their own system?
Right now, the focus is definitely a larger water system consolidating a state small or a domestic well. I think there is some language. It's not as detailed. If there is that type of information available, we can definitely add it. As of right now, I don't feel like we have a lot in terms of guidance provided for that type of situation.
All right. Well, thanks for the suggestion. Gary, you've been waiting patiently. Go ahead, and then we'll come back to more chat questions.
Thank you. I'm with the Valley Center Municipal Water District. We're not a county agency, though I have monitored this process closely because I realize at some point it's going to involve existing water agencies. On the issue of consolidation, it's thought of in a popular way in many locations about how to solve water problems. But I think the county should be advised that there are costs involved. There's the physical costs of extending physical water systems. In San Diego County, there's also the cost of annexing properties to the Metropolitan Water District and the Water Authority and to the retail agency. So there's significant cost if you're going to extend imported water to an area that is dependent on local groundwater. There is a cost just in the issue of annexation. Also, it should be pointed out that this would be going on during a period where the larger agencies' water supply has been reduced. We're facing reductions next year. It's going to be difficult for me to extend water supply to a smaller entity when it takes water away from my existing customer base. That's a difficult thing to do. And then finally, we're dealing with the water use efficiency regulations that have been developed over the last couple of years and so forth. So we're going to be given a specific allocation based on indoor water use and outdoor water use and other things. So this needs to be cross-checked with the State Water Resources Control Board. If I indeed take on the responsibility of serving another sub-area, then I need to have an adjustment to my water use efficiency regulations going forward. So these are real world issues that if you're going to suggest consolidation as a possible option, I think some of these issues need to be mentioned to the county governments who may not be in the water business and may not face these issues on a day-to-day basis. That's my comments. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for bringing those consideration. Young Shin, go ahead.
I remember in the work group discussion, there's probably one point that good to mention. In the work group discussion, some of this related question comes up. And then the certain county was actually making a little bit more careful delineation regarding what the county's role, especially, for example, in the consolidation or even building intertie, what are they? Because it is the agreement and how the process was actually between two water systems. It's not really county is a signatory in this particular matter. So there's some suggestion discussion regarding the county role in this part is basically pointed out that this is a possibility and the county may be facilitating the conversation to see whether or not there's any possibility for this type of thing happen. You know, the cost issue and all the issue that you just referred to is all necessary consideration, see whether or not we can get to a mutual agreement in that way. So it's not really a requirement, but it's just something that will this work? If this work, and that's great. If it doesn't work, what's your other option, right? So one way or the other, we're trying to get the point is trying to get the small water system taken care of.
Thanks, Youngshin. I see in the chat Christopher weighing in on exactly this point. The guide might need to explicitly indicate to county elected and appointed officials that not all efforts will be able to be paid for by state programs, such as i.e. the counties will have to provide some funding for staff and program management. And also that the counties don't have full authority to direct activities, that will have to work with water districts and GSAs. So thank you for that comment. I'm looking to see other comments. Will be helpful to have people ask their questions in person and also share which county or which area you're representing, just for context. So go ahead, Becky, I think it's you on the 831, and then following that, we'll hear from Ann.
Hello, thank you. This is Becky Steinbrunner. I think the agency that we're also not including in this discussion is LAFCO. That has a lot to do with any annexations and service boundary changes. So that needs to be included in the guidebook, I think. And I have a lot of thoughts about consolidation too, and a lot of concerns actually as well. I think it's important for the counties to establish clear criteria when there would be the option of consolidation considered, and it needs to be very clear what would trigger such considerations. Doing that, I think, will help build trust with the domestic well owners and the small water system operators, because it's a stick hanging over our head that we all really worry about and not necessarily want to do because of the expense, because of losing autonomy, and quite frankly, because our water quality may drastically change for the worst if some of the small water systems are perhaps not chlorinating or whatever. So that's what I want to say about the consolidation. Regarding the data gaps, again, it goes back to an issue of public trust, getting that data from the domestic well owners, small water system operators. They need to be assured how the data will be used, and what would be the criteria that would trigger emergency actions that could possibly restrict their use of pumping? And would neighboring larger water systems also be restricted to preserve the groundwater levels? I think that's an important issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky, for bringing those criteria. And just with regard to trust, I just want to highlight Martha's comment asking, is public education around domestic water well management being addressed anywhere in the guidebook? If not, it needs to be addressed somewhere. I'm continuously surprised by how little many well owners know about management, tracking of their well water resources, or site management strategies that they can use to reduce the pressure on their wells, both short-term and long-term options. And I know that the guidebook is going to have public engagement and outreach components. So I don't know if you want to just give a little preview to that, Maritza.
Yeah, so that's actually chapter 6. It's the public outreach information and engagement component. It actually provides a couple of questions that would be helpful in answering when engaging with the public. There's also just recommendations on, how can you best distribute information when dealing with these different components of complying with SB 532 legislation. It's, for example, for the short-term response actions, it's also making it very clear on how this information is going to be distributed and how it will be used. So all of that is already addressed within chapter 6, and that's something that we'll definitely focus on during the next public meeting. But and just so folks know, the guidebook is right now going through internal review through the other state departments. So if there is anything else that needs to be added or is missing, will definitely be flagged in that review process. So we definitely accounted for that. It is definitely a very important component to be able to implement any future solutions with regards to this.
Thank you. And Martha, I see you have a hand raised. Did you want to add on this topic before we go to other topics?
Yes, thank you, Maureen. I really appreciate the fact that this is included in a later chapter. I'm working in West Marin. We've got a landowners association that's now really collaborating on what do we need to make sure our neighbors know about wells and just management through this drought. And it's there that, even with very sophisticated people, they tend to think about their wells as a faucet rather than a system that they're managing, and how this integrated site management of how they use their water, the efficiency of the water, which actually fits in with making conservation a California way of life. There's a lot of things that if the well owners are managing their sites proactively, they do a lot to keep themselves out of trouble and their neighbors out of trouble. Now, that's not going to solve everything, but it's almost, from a data gap standpoint, it's one of the most foundational pieces about how these systems are being managed, that there's an empowerment piece here that we need to bring to the table, where people can do a lot to be proactive across their home, their landscape, to help support the way in which a well is responding, particularly during droughts. So I just want to underscore it, because I'm surprised at how naive so many people are.
Thanks, Martha. And I think you make that really important point in there, that it's not just about the individual, but it's the collective, that it's important in terms of outreach and knowledge, and working as a community and as a system. So Anne, you've been waiting patiently. We'll go to you, and then Amy.
Hello, thanks for taking my question. I'm a domestic well owner. I do not fall into the disadvantaged community, and I'm not eligible for extension of a municipal supply. I know this is a problem. Wells are having problems because of drought, but also because of overpumping of groundwater. When the farmers talk about being asked to fallow their land to help the groundwater basin, they seem very agreeable as long as they get a suitable payment for doing so. We domestic well owners are suffering from over pumping and drought effects, but probably mostly from over pumping. Our wells are going dry. We're being asked to spend $30,000 to $40,000 of our own money to dig a deeper well. Yet I don't hear anything about financial assistance for domestic well owners who have kept good tabs on how their wells are functioning. I think at a minimum, a drought program should also perhaps discuss recommendations to the county or to the GSA that domestic well owners should get some sort of compensation, but also at a minimum, perhaps develop some financial plans that domestic well owners can tap into. I don't know if that could be on property taxes or other kind of levies, but really, I think the financial pressure on domestic well owners is being ignored. Thank you.
Thank you. And just for context, can you tell us what region you're joining from?
I'm in Butte County. Hi, Cammie. And I'm a domestic well representative on the VINA Advisory Committee. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Thank you for providing that perspective. Really appreciate it. Go ahead, Amy.
Yeah, just to follow up on my written comment. So I know, at least from our perspective, we do have large areas of our county where there's not necessarily an existing public water system for them to intertie with, but there's, you know, a number of state smalls and actually what we call non-publics, which are 2 to 4s, as well as individual wells in the same area. And one of the things that we already know that exists that's a struggle for new developments is the creation of new public water systems. So I think part of the perspective, at least for me, is, you know, we're making this plan with these long-term, which at some point I assume will be actionable long-term items that come down from the state, not just things that we hope will happen over a course of time. And if we don't have the tools to address those challenges that we know we already face when it comes to consolidation, or getting those into a more cohesive system, I guess, that might operate better or have more redundancy. For me, that's a challenge, and I'm not sure if that's addressed anywhere in here, or if these are tools. You know, are there tools in here on how to even get the conversation started with these smaller water systems or individual well owners to get them to the point of consolidation on a willing basis, like someone mentioned earlier, as opposed to something that could be forced down the line, which obviously is much harder as a state small versus a non-functioning smaller state system with another system. So kind of just my perspective on something that would be nice to be included, maybe on how to start those conversations, to talk to those systems and those individual well owners to get them to the point where that works for them.
That's great. Thanks, Amy. That's really important. And so, Marita, I'm assuming that that's something that will be addressed in that chapter around outreach and engagement. I don't know if that's where it fits in, or if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, that would definitely be within chapter 6, and we can definitely touch more on it during the next public meeting.
Great. All right. Thank you. So it looks like we've addressed all the comments and questions. Anybody else want to add to it before we move to our next steps? Any last comments? And of course, we welcome your comments after the meeting as well, as we continue to work on this. All right. Well, with that in mind, I think I'll invite you, Julie, to share with us next steps and.
Yep. Thanks, Ari. Thank you all for your input. This is really helpful. And it seems like this is the beginning of a much longer conversation that I hope will continue over, yes, into next year and on as counties grapple with more of these issues, but also bring best practices back to us and share with everybody else. So I really appreciate Denise sharing your experience from Tulare County so that everybody can learn from it. It's really helpful to hear, what everybody has been working on and what's worked, what hasn't worked, and kind of challenges up that we're all faced with for implementing this. And so for the wrap up and next steps, first, I just wanted to point out so going over the guidebook timeline again, that Maritza shared earlier. So this, the red dot is meeting 3 right now. And that takes us to this, what is pretty close to the end of this process for the guidebook. But remember, this is not the end of the process continuing to talk to counties and to figure out other ways to help counties with this planning process and then into the implementation phases. So today we went over chapters 4 and 5. Then the next meeting that we're going to have after we have this internal review period right now. We'll make revisions, and then when we are preparing it for the public draft review period. So at the beginning of that public draft review period, we'll have meeting number 4, the final one of the guidebook development process. And that we expect it to be in early or mid-December. And then we'll walk through what all is covered in the guidebook, somewhat briefly, but you'll also have the text of it to review. And then we'll receive your comments, which we'll later work on incorporating those for the final version. So there are a few engagement opportunities. But first we want to see in the next slide, Arit, do we have so I wanted to just introduce Heather Shannon. She's a supervising engineer geologist with DWR's Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. She wanted to share a couple of items that they have that are coming up that relate to SB 552 and also the groundwater sustainability agencies. So Heather, are you able to?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Julie. So just a couple items here. So DWR has been developing a fact sheet that will help bridge the gap for counties carrying out SB 552 requirements and GSAs that are working under SGMA, and outline how they can be coordinating and aligning their efforts. So the fact sheet should be available before the end of the year, and will coincide with the release really of this county guidebook and some other GSA guidance that we're developing. And so the goal is that this fact sheet will be helpful for those counties that overlap in groundwater basins that have GSAs actively managing groundwater. So we strongly encourage that local coordination and near-term drought actions and long-term groundwater management. The other item is our drinking water guidance. DWR has been developing a drinking water guidance document to assist local GSAs and highlight considerations as they move forward with implementation of their groundwater sustainability plans. Our approach for the document is to make it modular and provide a guidance document as well as a website toolkit where we can make resources available for use by GSAs or really any, could be counties, if they find the resources useful for them. And so we anticipate releasing this guidance document in the winter timeframe along the same lines as the county document. So you'll be, just keep your eyes peeled for information on that in the next coming months. We anticipate having a webinar to accompany the release of the document. So all I wanted to share.
Thanks, Heather. Great. So if you go to the next slide, thanks. So in terms of the engagement opportunities for this process, for this guidebook, today's meeting materials we will post the recording by next week to the webpage, and I can put the webpage in the chat in a minute. So that's where we have posted the other recordings and agendas. So then we will also have, if you would like the PowerPoint presentation, you can join the SharePoint site. And if you want to be added to the SharePoint site, if you're not already registered for it, then you can email this wue@water.ca.gov to get access, or just ask for access to the SB 552 site. And if that doesn't work, you can email me and I'll just send you the PowerPoint directly, just to avoid complications. Now, so as I mentioned, we're going to have we invite you to the next public meeting. That'll be the 4th one in December. We will figure out the date, announce it soon, to launch the public comment period for the draft guidebook. Then we'll have, if you have questions or comments in the meantime, feel free to submit questions to this wue@water.ca.gov. And we hope to hear from you to receive comments during the public comment period, so that can help finalize the guidebook. And thank you so much for attending today. Since we have a couple minutes, I see that there is the question from Mario Carlson in the chat asking about, have most counties, are they actively drafting their 552 plans or waiting for the release of the guidebook, or somewhere in between? And I have to pull it up, but we did ask that question in the previous meeting and had a little bit of a bar chart of, who was doing in what phase. Most counties hadn't started their process, but a few have. So that's, if that helps a little bit, Mario, and maybe we can repaste that poll from the second webinar into the meeting notes, maybe from the, so that people can see that again. But yeah, and we're also looking into some type of a website where it can show compliance with SB 552 or partial compliance, so that there is a place to go to submit information if it's been completed. But we should know more about that in the next public meeting. So thank you again for attending today. And I see a question. But I also wanted to thank Orit and Maritza for all their hard work in this guidebook and this process.
It looks like Becky has her hand raised, so if you can just make a quick comment, and then we'll close the meeting.
Yes, thank you. This is Becky Steinbrunner. Just a quick comment. Santa Cruz County has basically completed our SB 552 draft plan, and it is set to go, I believe, to the County Board of Supervisors for first consideration and possible approval this month. So you could be looking for that at the Santa Cruz County Environmental Health website. They have a really good website showing all of the summary notes from the meetings that the working group held, and the subsequent approval by the Water Commission, and the ultimate draft plan that will be going before our Board of Supervisors this month. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky. Would you mind pasting that? Oh, you're on the phone.
I am, but if you want to provide me a website, I can send that to someone. It's on Santa Cruz County Government Environmental Health website, and there is a special tab for SB 552.
Hi, this is Sierra Ryan from the county. I can post that in the link.
Okay, I think I just
it's
pasted it for you.
okay. It's gonna be it's actually gonna be going in December along with our climate action and adaptation plan.
Great. Well, this is a nice update since Sierra, you did the presentation at our first workshop. So great to see about the progress that you've been making. And I think with that, we're done. So thanks everyone for very thoughtful comments and questions. Been a really great discussion, and we look forward to incorporating your input and connecting with you again in soon. I don't think we have a date, but soon it is. All right. Thank you all.